I'd like to introduce, without further ado, our next speaker. He's a Scots old boy, an avid talker, and a serial entrepreneur. Please welcome Will Harris.
Right, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I feel as though there is no more appropriate way for me to begin this talk than to make a bit of a confession. You see, I have been apocalyptically nervous over the last few weeks about giving this talk, just terrified, to the point where my housemates have come up with the realisation that I'm actually currently having a midlife crisis, which is pretty terrible because at the age of 21 it means I'm going to be flat out hitting 42. But I decided perhaps the best way to get involved in this talk was to go back to my childhood. So in a disgustingly, sickeningly fit of nostalgia, I went through a shoebox full of cards that I used to bring back to my parents from school, from primary school, as young as the age of 5, that detailed what I wanted to do when I was older. And these cards were part of a class called Future Planning. So when I was about 5, I came home and told my parents, Mum, Dad, when I grow up, I want to be a brain surgeon. Very noble, you might think. What an ambitious young kid. What it didn't say on the card was that this is, of course, because I wanted to give people frontal lobotomies and then create an army of people I could control and who would do exactly what I said. Then, at the age of 8, I came home and told my parents that when I grow up, I wanted to be a pilot. At this point, you've probably realised that future planning was a really bad name for this class, and none of these plans have panned out for me very well at all. Then, at the age of 10, I had the audacity to come home with a card that simply said, Mum, Dad, when I grow up, I want to be a billionaire. And as you can see, as a child, I had a pretty questionable moral compass. I assure you that's all changed. There was, however, one card that I didn't come back with. And that was the card that would have said, Mum, Dad, when I grow up, I want to be gay. There are plenty of reasons that I didn't take that card home, most importantly because it would have sucked the oxygen out of the room, kind of like it has here now. I think I'd be struggling to light a candle on stage. But inevitably, that was the card that, as fate would have it, turned out to be true. And so, as you may have guessed, I'm here to talk about the elephant in the room tonight. The big, pink elephant in the room. And I guess I'm posing the question then, what is the gay future? In Australia, this question is particularly important at the moment, and I feel as though for this reason it's quite a timely topic. But as with any speculation, you really need to go and look at the past, evaluate the present, and then come to some sort of conclusion as to your hopes for the future. So I'm going to start by taking us back in time a little bit to Plato. Now, Plato, in his Symposium, among other seminal works, gives us an understanding of Greek culture several centuries ago, I should say, and a hedonistic experimentation that would occur, a very liberal culture. And yet somehow through progress, through discovering that the world is round, for example, through bettering ourselves as a civilization and a group of people, we seem to have become a little less accepting and a little less focused on being liberal and fair. Many of you will be forgiven for not recognising this man. This is Dr. Alan Turing. Among other things, he paved the way for modern computers. But the reason he should be remembered most is because he single-handedly cracked the Enigma code and won the war for the Allied forces. However, in 1956, his home was robbed. And when the police turned up to interview him, after several questions, they established that he was gay. What followed was an arrest, an embarrassing public trial, and eventually, tragically, his chemical castration. Now, this is shocking. And it's nice to think that in our current context, we can look at this and say, this is shocking, but we've come so far. We don't have to worry about this anymore. Well, in the case of Australia and the United Kingdom, this is true. But I belong to a gay community, and a true use of the word community is in an international context. And unfortunately, for many people, this sense of community and this sense of progression is an alien thought. I'm worried at the moment about whether or not one day I'll be allowed to marry the person I love in the country I was born in. But whilst that seems like a big deal for me, for many people, there are so many greater challenges. These two young men were convicted of the crime in Iran only last year of being gay, being in a relationship. The real tragedy is that both these men were dobbed into the authorities by one of their fathers, who was so ashamed that he had to dob them in. And in Iran, as with many countries, particularly in the Middle East and Africa, being gay gets you to the gallows. So it's even more tragic, however, that these two young men join a list into the thousands of gay, lesbian and transgender people who every year are persecuted for something that they cannot control, something that they could never write on a card in a future planning class. And it's perhaps most tragic that these people are persecuted and sometimes executed for what I like to think of as an innocent deviance, an innocent difference to everybody else, to the norm. So it's easy to look at that photo and read that story and be thrown into a pit of despair and think, how can you ever come back from that? And that's how I felt when I first read it. But there is hope. And without pandering to the cliche, this hope is real and it's tangible. And the good news is it's happening now. Some of you may have seen the speech given by the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at the United Nations in December 2011. Amongst other things, she said that human rights were gay rights and that gay rights were human rights. And this marked a huge shift in foreign policy for the United States. For the first time in history, the world superpower is exerting influence diplomatically over other countries, particularly in the Middle East and Africa, to improve their gay rights record and to help people who need it most in their own countries. But I think the real reason that change is occurring and will continue to occur for so many issues being discovered tonight is perhaps the most fundamental doctrine that we hold to be true as an international community. And that, of course, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which in Article 1, its most fundamental statement is that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. And I like to think of brotherhood as being particularly applicable to the relationship that is continually developing between the Australian heterosexual community and the gay community. A lot is changing. There are some people who might tell you, for example, that change isn't as inevitable as everybody thinks. That gay marriage, for example, in Australia, shouldn't be legalised. But I say change happens every day. And if we're to live as one in a country where we can, in the future, have pride, then that needs to be a future predicated on necessary changes for the betterment of our country. I say to people who think that change isn't possible that they're completely wrong. 3 years ago, for example, if you had have said to me I was going to stand up here in front of a room and give a speech about how it's okay to be gay, I would have told you were insane, and then I probably would have said, what are you talking about? I'm not gay. But of course, things change. And tonight I'm here to compel you to join me in trying to change the status quo and to give people, not just in Australia, but in countries all over the world, access to the most fundamental human right. And that fundamental human right is access to happiness. And if we can't have access to happiness, what can we really have? I believe that allowing gay marriage will not harm anybody. I believe that it will not delegitimise any religious body or any group of people. I believe that what it will achieve is the betterment and the allowance of people to truly seek happiness when that is what they deserve. And I feel as though being here tonight, when I once thought I could never do that, is a true example of how change can occur. And I want to thank you so much for allowing me to be here and for being here with me.